Sie können den Bildschirm sehen?
Ja, funktioniert alles.
Ja. Wunderbar. So with that, we are going to change languages. Okay. So as just announced, I'm going to talk about Kallawaya, the secret language of Lake Titicaca. And this is an outline of my talk. So I'll try to guide you through the paper, through the talk actually. I'll first give you an brief introduction to the Kallawaya and the background to the language before providing an overview of mixed and secret languages in general. I'll also quite briefly provide an overview of the history of research on Kallawaya before coming to what I'd like to call the new Kallawaya story. So Kallawaya as a deliberately created language. And here I'll address topics like the Kallawaya lexicon, but also a bunch of manipulations, linguistic manipulations, encompassing etymological, grammatical, and phonological manipulations, before concluding with a summary of my finding. And if time permits, I would like to address also quite briefly some implications of my research and potential future research. And you should have a kind of handout, so to speak. It's just one slide, it's a takeout concerning the Andean languages, because I'm going to mention a lot of Andean languages, and I'm not quite sure how familiar you are. I guess you're not overly familiar, which is quite okay. But if you feel that you're losing track in between, right? So please don't hesitate and ask, right? So just come back to me. I mean, we've got some minutes for discussion, so discussion, questions and comments should be postponed. But if you feel that you're kind of overwhelmed with all the information on the Andes, please just switch on your micro and ask. Fire away. Okay, so, okay, that's the introduction to Kallawaya. I'm sorry for my slides, I'm somewhat reluctant to change. Here we go. So Kallawaya is a secret mixed language spoken by herbalists. And here in map 1, you can see we're obviously in South America, that is Bolivia. And this red square here indicates the area we're going to focus on. That is more or less the department, the Bolivian department of Bautista Saavedra, which is indicated here, which is also the heart of the Kallawaya herbalism, right? So quite close to Lake Titicaca and the border. So that's practically a border region. On the right side here, that is Bolivia. On the left side, we've got Peru, and that is the region where Kallawaya is spoken, including Apolo outside the department Bautista Saavedra. Okay. I'm sorry. Okay, here we go. So who are the Kallawaya herbalists? They are traditional and itinerant healers who travel quite widely to offer their medicinal services, and possibly also to collect medicinal plants. So that is not entirely certain, but quite likely. And we know from the literature that they travel from Bolivia over Ecuador and Colombia, so the northern part of South America, until Panama. And they do so, or did so at least, annually. So each year they made the trip from Bolivia to Panama and back again, which is quite a lot, right? So that's quite a trip. And the native language of the herbalists is Bolivian Quechua, but they usually also have command of Aymara and Spanish. And as I said, I'll give you an introduction to all these Andean languages in a couple of slides, actually. The use of Kallawaya is rapidly decreasing, and it is unclear whether the language is spoken at all today. But if so, the language must be regarded as severely endangered, and we are probably not speaking of more than, let's say, 100 to 200 speakers at best, right? And the Kallawaya language, or the secret language Kallawaya, probably emerged sometime in the 18th or 19th century. So it's quite a young language. It's a recent development, which fits into the overall picture of mixed languages we have. So mixed languages are usually relatively young languages, missing the historicity of non-mixed languages. So I already said that Kallawaya is a mixed and secret language. So apparently, obviously, we've got two components that characterize Kallawaya. So on the one hand, Kallawaya is a mixed language. which means its grammar comes from a Southern Quechua variety, while the lexicon is allegedly based on the extinct and genetically unrelated Pukina language. So genetically unrelated here means genetically unrelated to Quechua, or Aymara for that matter, right? So that is a mixed component of Kallawaya. And Kallawaya is also a secret language, which means that it is used only by male initiated herbalists. So it's used by non-initiated men, and all women and children is completely prohibited, right? So we know that some wives of Kallawaya healers have some passive command of Kallawaya, so they can understand Kallawaya, but they are not allowed to use it, right? So even if they knew some words of Kallawaya, they are completely forbidden to utter these words. So it's an all-male secret society of healers who uses Kallawaya. Let's start with Kallawaya as a mixed language. I already said it, that it is characterized by a lexicon grammar split, where the lexicon is allegedly mainly or mostly based on extinct Pukina, which is, I already mentioned that, is genetically unrelated to any modern Andean language, right? And the grammar of Kallawaya comes from Quechua, which is also the native language of the Kallawaya herbalists. And here are some really is just the backbone of Quechua grammar, which is also the grammar of Kallawaya, right? So Quechua, read Kallawaya 2, is a suffixing language. It's head final. It's got a case system, not an overly elaborated case system, but elaborated enough. It's also marked by an inclusive-exclusive split in the first person plural. Quechua, and in accordance with that, Kallawaya 2 doesn't mark grammatical gender and doesn't have articles, right? Okay, so these are really just, as I just said, the backbones of Quechua grammar. And here's an example so that for those of you who are not familiar with mixed languages, so that you can, that you get an impression of what a mixed language looks like. Now we've got a sentence here: I'm carrying all the medicine in a new bag. Nisi ikachkani komuntin soketa wane itilapi. And the blue marked elements denote lexical material of diverse etymological origin, but it is non-Quechua, right? So Nisi and Ika, Komu, Soke, Wane, and Itila, this is all lexical material coming from whatever language, but not Quechua. The green, the slightly sickly green part is a grammatical material. That is Quechua and completely Quechua, right? For those of you, I know Quechua is taught at the LMU. For those of you who know a bit of Quechua, you will recognize these markers. We've got chka here, which is a progressive marker, and ni, which marks the first person. Tin is a associative marker. Ta marks a direct object, and pi is a locative marker. And that's what we understand by a mixed language. We've got the lexicon from whatever language is and the grammar from another language. And both are put together to form a new mixed language, right? Okay, and here I hope it works out. This is an audio recording made by Greg Anderson and David Harrison in 2007, just to give you an impression of what the language sounds like.
Nisi achane Max Chura Mamane Kallawaya Chari Nisi Sekane Kai Sikuman Pacha Kuchaita Sejo. Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know whether someone of you speaks actually Quechua or understands a bit of Quechua, but you can, if you do, try and check. I guess you didn't understand too much, right? It sounded quite Quechua. And by just, passing by, you could think, oh, well, it's Quechua, but actually it's not, because we hardly understand anything, right? With the exception of Kallawaya, maybe. And here's a picture. It's that is the speaker we just heard is not the person here in the picture. The picture here, the photograph shows Iarion Ramos and the local coordinator, that one, Jose Laraya Pita, discussing plants. And here, just to give you an impression of what these people look like. And it's not really quite well visible, but you see here this bag hanging down from his neck, and this is what we just had. This is this bag, this itila, right, used to carrying around herbs and medicinal plants. Oh, sorry. Okay, now Kallawaya is not only a mixed language, it is first and foremost, I think, it is a secret language, and it is used by the traditional herbalists during curing rituals, right, curing healing rituals, and when they travel to offer their medicinal services. And it marks a secret in-group communication. So I think this is the most important function of Kallawaya, marking an in-group, secret in-group communication. So it's a kind of ticket, so to speak, right? If you want to belong to the Kallawaya society, to the herbalists, you need to know, you need to speak Kallawaya. Without Kallawaya, no entry. You are not a Kallawaya. You might be a healer, but you are not a Kallawaya healer, right? So in order to pass as a Kallawaya herbalist, who are, by the way, I should have mentioned that before, they are considered a kind of elite, right? So if you feel you need special advice, or if you feel particularly ill or something, you call for a specialist, and that is a Kallawaya herbalist, right? And as I said, this the knowledge of Kallawaya, of the secret language, is a kind of, is your entry ticket into this Kallawaya society. And now the question, of course, is what is actually secret about Kallawaya? When we are talking about a secret language, what does it mean? And here we've got to say the herbalists display their knowledge of Kallawaya along with their religious and medicinal competence openly, that is in front of the patients, and that of course contributes to the recognition as a Kallawaya healer. So, I mean, it's quite important that you are recognized by your patients as a Kallawaya healer, right? Because they pay for it. So you want, and they get what they paid for, right? They want a Kallawaya herbalist. You've got to show that you are a Kallawaya herbalist, meaning you speak Kallawaya. Thus, it is not the very existence of the language itself or its use by the herbalists that is secret, but rather it is the meaning of the words that is secret and which is not to be given away. Right, so it's an open, it's common knowledge that these herbalists know Kallawaya, right? That is not a secret, and in fact, actually, you can check on the internet if you like to. You can order, or at least you could order, medicinal pre-packed herbs on the internet by the Kallawaya Society. So they're really on the internet, but that is not the secret, right? But the meaning of the words is to be kept secret. Okay, so when talking about secrecy, we also have to come, or we've got to explain linguistic manipulations, right? Which will be quite important when talking about the new Kallawaya story. And I understand by linguistic manipulations, deliberate modifications of phonological, lexical, and or grammatical material meant to render a language unintelligible to outsiders, right? So, and the crucial point here is that we're talking about deliberate modifications, consciously and deliberately modified material. Okay. Then another question that is not particularly relevant to my talk, but still quite interesting and offering potential for further research: how is Kallawaya transmitted? Little to practically nothing is known about how Kallawaya is transmitted and acquired, right? We assume, and it appears quite plausible, that Kallawaya is transmitted from father to son, and only if there are no male relatives or none that are suitable, may knowledge about the Kallawaya herbalism and its associated secret language be passed on to female descendants, right? But quite how this intergenerational transmission actually works is, to the best of my knowledge, undescribed yet. So if you are interested in doing field work and finding out something really not yet discovered, so here's the topic for you. So you can do some field work on the transmission of Kallawaya and acquisition, right? We simply do not know how it works. Okay, now I already mentioned Pukina as the allegedly main lexifier of Kallawaya. That is a language that is providing the bulk of the lexicon for Kallawaya. And Pukina is closely associated with a pre-colonial Tiwanaku Empire, also situated at Lake Titicaca, and it flourished roughly between 650 and 1050 AD. So well in pre-colonial times, right? So about 1,000 or 1,500 years ago. After the demise of the Tiwanaku Empire, the Pukina language continued to be a prestigious language until colonial times, right? So if we go back to the, let's say, 16th, 17th, even still in this early 18th century, Pukina was commonly referred to as a lengua general, a general language, a lingua franca, right? Which could be used alongside Quechua and Aymara. But then it became extinct sometime in the 19th century, and it is certainly one of the tragedies of the language that it is, of the Pukina language, that it is only poorly documented, right? We have only 263 lexical bases, and they are maintained in a religious and a Christian document, right? We had an entire grammar, colonial grammar of Pukina, but it was stored in a church. The church burned down, and along with the church, the grammar. So that is really a tragedy. And well, so all we have are these 263 lexical bases. And I think it almost goes without saying that it is a bit difficult, right? The material is difficult because it is religious Christian material and appears to be a translation and not an elaborate translation as it is from a Quechua text. And of course, in this religious Christian text, we find a lot of concepts which are not native, which are not indigenous. So they are talking a lot about sin, for example, right? And repentance. How can you repent something? These are utterly Christian concepts, right? But not native or Andine concepts. So for that matter, we know how sin, for example, is expressed in Pukina, but we don't know how the word knife sounded in Pukina, right? So that is a problem, so in principle. And please try to keep that in mind. We have only 263 lexical bases, and they are somewhat artificial to a certain degree, right? Yes, I already mentioned that Pukina is genetically unrelated to Quechua and Aymara, but some genetic relationships to lowland Arawakan languages have been suggested, but that is something that is still also research of the future, hopefully. Okay, so just to give you an impression of where we are, so this is a map here showing the distribution of indigenous languages in the 16th century, and the red circle here indicates the Pukina heartland at Lake Titicaca. Now, and just before we go to the colonies, let's stay a moment at Tiwanaku, which is a place or the culture, the empire associated with the Pukina language. This is quite well known, the Gate of the Sun at the archaeological site of Tiwanaku. And if you, well, just Google Bolivia, this will be one of the first pictures you find, right? It's quite famous. Now, the Tiwanaku Empire had colonies, which is attested by strong Pukina toponymy, right? And one of the colonies was between the modern Bolivian highland cities of Cochabamba and Sucre, so very roughly around here somewhere. And another colony was around Moquegua in southern Peru, right? So, and as you can see, that was really a quite well, widespread language, actually. It really served as a kind of lingua franca. And now we jump a bit in time and come to the 20th, or I think mid-20th century, right? And that is an outtake you got as a kind of handout. So whenever you feel you're losing track or feel overwhelmed by all the names, you may refer back to that slide. Okay, so this is to give you...
Sorry, at this point I'd like to apologize because we weren't able to send the handout.
Ah, okay.
The idea was to send it via Zoom, but that's currently not possible, it seems. So we would like to send it afterwards as an email.
Okay, that's fine.
That's okay.
Yeah, right. That's fine. If you still have any questions. Okay, so As you don't have the handout, then whenever you feel you really don't know what I'm talking about right now, then as I said, please feel free to interrupt me. Okay, so this is an overview of the languages we are going to mention in the talk. Number 7 here with a red circle is Kallwaya, right? You can see that here. And the green square indicates the Andine languages. So Quechua is one of them. It's a grammar providing language of Kallwaya. It's also the famous language of the Incas and still spoken by 8 to 10 million speakers between Ecuador and the north. So well, stretching from, or even southern Colombia, with the main part of Quechua, northern Quechua, spoken here in Ecuador around Quito until the Marañón River, stretching over the Peruvian highlands until the last southern pocket of Quechua in Santiago del Estero, right? And it's a dominant indigenous language in the Peruvian highlands. You can see that here. So everything here, these shaded areas here are Quechua speaking. And as I said, it's native language of the Kallawaya herbalists. Now, Aymara is spoken by 2 to 3 million speakers in the Bolivian highlands. So that is roughly the area where you find Aymara. And here it is also the dominant indigenous language. And of course, we've got some close contact between Quechua and Aymara around Lake Titicaca. We also have Uru and Chipaya. So Uru, or as it is called here, Uchumataku, is number 8, is spoken at Lake Titicaca, and number 9, slightly overshaded here, is Chipaya at Lake Coipasa. So Chipaya is the only language still spoken, and both languages, these 2 languages too, contributed to Kallawaya and were important for the kind of formations, you might want to say, of the secret language. Then Atacameño, which is a Spanish name, of course, or a Hispanicized form, which is by its indigenous name is called Kunza. It's spoken here. Number 10 is Atacameño. It was probably in isolate, spoken in northern Chile, in or near the Atacama Desert, hence its name, Atacameño. It's extinct, probably extinct today, and also insufficiently documented. And lastly, and this is a language not indicated here on the map, we've got erste, which is spoken roughly here, so on the last corner of Bolivia, very close to the Brazilian border. Erste is a small language of the Tacanan language family of the Bolivian lowlands. And if you wonder why it's somehow, what it has to do with Kallawaya of the highlands, well, until around 150 years ago, erste used to be spoken much further to the west, that is closer, or at the eastern Andine foothills, roughly about here. And that's much closer to the Kallawaya area, right? And it was through the rubber boom that the erste speakers were pushed, or well, convinced to migrate further down the rivers further into the lowlands of Bolivia, right? So these are the languages that are somehow important for Kallawaya. Okay, so are you still with me? Any questions? No? Okay, so clear as that? Perfect. Okay, let's go on to the overview of mixed and secret languages. I'll be relatively brief about that, right? We are not going into great detail here. First, I would like to give you a definition of what a mixed language is. So a mixed language can be defined as a language where some parts of it come from one language while other parts derive from another language or other languages, and the parental languages are usually not genetically related. So the resulting mix is stable, right? Which is which distinguishes mixed languages from, let's say, pidgins, for example. Okay, and we've got 3 main types of mixed languages. We can distinguish the lexicon grammar mixed languages, which is the type Kallwaya belongs to. We've got noun verb mixed languages, and we've got form structure mixed languages. And those of you who attended my language contact seminar should know about that, or at least you hopefully remember. And these two, the first two mixed language types, are also referred to as intertwined languages, whereas form structure mixed languages are called converted languages. Now, intertwined languages are essentially languages that are composed of two mutually dependent components that form a unique whole. So each of the components has its origin in a different source language, and none of the components are sufficient on their own, right? And I mean, this is quite easily understandable if you try to imagine a lexicon grammar mixed language trying to tear it apart, right? So you cannot just have the lexicon without the grammar, that is incomplete, but also grammar without a lexicon doesn't work out, right? So you need both parts to form a new whole. So Kallwaya, of course, is an instance of a lexicon grammar mixed language, and also lexicon grammar mixed languages are the most frequent type of mixed languages, right? So I mean, mixed languages are in general quite rare. You don't have a lot of mixed languages around, but if you happen to come across a mixed language at all, so there's quite a chance that it is a lexicon grammar mixed language. Now, verb mixed languages, as their name suggests, show a mixture of verbal and nominal system. The verbal system comes from one language, the nominal system from another one, and probably the most well-known example is midship, Canadian midship, spoken by a population that refers to itself as métis, so mixed actually in French. And here in midship, we've got the nominal system from French, but the verbal system comes from the indigenous Cree language, right? And they both come together to form a new language. And converted languages are languages that have adopted the grammar of another language or other languages more or less wholesale without changing the lexicon. So with these kinds of languages, the entire lexicon and all grammatical morphemes come from one source language, while the formal and syntactic structure come from a different source language or a different few source languages. This is not a particularly frequent type, right? And one of the better known examples is Sri Lankan Malay, which combines words and forms from Bazar Malay with structures from Tamil and Sinhala, right? So these are the types of mixed languages that are around. And now, because I will address that in my in the part about Kallwaya, the formation processes of mixed languages. And here I would like to quote Felicity Meekins, who very aptly remarked that no one theory provides a unified account of mixed language genesis, which accounts for all languages which have been identified as mixed. So, and I'm only slightly exaggerating when I'm saying that for each and every single mixed language, there is one theory of formation, right? So each mixed language has its own theory of formation. So it's a bit of a nightmare, actually. But we'll try to wriggle our ways through this formation process disaster. Okay, let's have a look at some of the more important explanations of formation processes assumed for mixed languages. And I'm talking only about unidirectional approaches, that is, approaches that assume a shift from one language into the direction of another language, right? And probably the most important and best known formation process is borrowing. That means an incomplete language shift, right? And closely related to that is fossilized code switching. Not overly frequent, but important for our purposes here is relexification and also paralexification, as well as the notion of language repertoires. Now we'll just have a very brief look at that. As I said, I'm not going into too much detail here. If you feel you have a question or something, or don't know what I'm talking about anymore, please feel free to ask me. Okay, so borrowing approaches, right? Borrowing meaning an incomplete shift. So borrowing approaches assume an incomplete language shift along the borrowing scale, right? From borrowing only lexical material to borrowing morphological and syntactic structures. So the borrowing scale is, well, Thomason's idea or proposal of a borrowing scale is probably the most prominent one. So we've got a borrowing scale with 4 stages, from starting with occasional contact and only borrowing lexical material over more and more intense contact, to finally in the last stage, heavy contact, daily contact, and practically, well, anything goes. That's how Thomason put it, right? So at the last contact stage, you can borrow practically anything and everything, right? Syntactic structures and everything. And one example of a mixed language that arose from an incomplete shift is Anglo-Romany. That means the people shifting from, so Anglo-Romany is a language spoken by the Rom people in the British Isles. And these people were shifting from their original language, from their community language towards English, but did not complete the shift, right? So they stopped somewhere short of stage 4, maybe in stage 3 or something, right? And did not complete the shift. So some parts of the former community language are preserved, and that's what is understood by an incomplete shift. Closely related to that is fossilized code switching. And in a language shift situation, I have notorious difficulties in pronouncing that. So where the shift has been completed, right, the erstwhile target language has become the community language, and there has thus been a functional turnover, right? So what has been the target language now is the language to be acquired is a language that is a dominant and daily community language of a population. And the former community language has been reduced to some kind of, well, yes, it's remembered only in fossilized code switching. That is, you often have frozen parts of the language remembered kind of en bloc, which are inserted by way of code switching into your new community language, right? But this kind of code switching is fossilized. So people are not able any longer to use code switching productively or spontaneously. So often this includes remembering phrases, ritual prayers and songs and stuff like that, right? So this is fossilized code switching. Now, a bit more interesting for us, at least from the perspective of Kallwaya, is relaxification, which is attested with at least one mixed language, the Ecuadorian media lengua, meaning middle language actually in English. And in this process of relaxification, the phonological form of Spanish is mapped onto the Quechua structure, replacing the phonological shapes of Quechua stems with Spanish forms, maintaining the rest of the Quechua structure, right? So that is, we do have a kind of Quechua skeleton, so to speak. The template, the grammatical and structural template is Quechua, and only in the meaning slots, in the word slots, so to speak, we insert Spanish words, right, or Spanish forms. The suffixes still come from Quechua. And what is quite interesting here is that we do not have a language shift situation. So media lengua arose around 100 years ago, so around 1900, 1920, when young men from rural and Quechua-speaking communities in Ecuador moved to the large cities to work, acquired, of course, a bit of Spanish, mainly lexical material, and upon coming back to their communities, kind of showed off, right, and inserted the Spanish words they learned into their native Quechua. And it's quite interesting because that media lengua then became the native language of these communities, right? So for practically 1 century, there were 2 to 3 generations that grew up speaking only media lengua as a native language. These people didn't speak Quechua any longer. They didn't speak Spanish. They couldn't understand Quechua. They couldn't understand Spanish, at least not without adjustment. But media lengua was really their native language. So we don't have a language shift situation here. And I can already say that, but we'll come back to that in greater detail. A formally similar process is also assumed for Kallwaya, right? So that just as a brief mention here. Now, we've got paralexification and language repertoires. Now, paralexification involves the existence of two lexicons in parallel. One language involved in the mix exists in its entirety with its grammar and lexicon intact. The other language merely provides a substantial reservoir of lexical material for inserting into the more dominant language's grammatical frame. And the African, I think, language from Tanzania, Maa, is supposed to represent an instance of paralexification. So this might be a bit confusing. So we've got two languages and one language is non-mixed, right? So we've got an orderly lexicon and an orderly grammar, and both fit together. And we also got something like a box of words, right? No grammar, but no grammatical structure, but only words. And from this box, people or speakers actually choose several word forms and insert them upon the non-mixed into the non-mixed variety if they want to if they wish to make their speech more interesting, right? Or if they want to disguise something and so on. And that is, this box of words, so to speak, is a language repertoire. And that is also quite important for Kallawaya, right? Okay, so just to kind of sum it up so far, for borrowing, including an incomplete language shift and fossilized code switching, we of course assume that language shift is the relevant formation process that led to the creation or formation genesis of a particular mixed language. In the case of paralexification, including these language repertoires or word boxes, right, there might be some language shift, but we don't know. It's not necessarily the case, apparently. And for media lingua, which arose through relaxification, we know there has been no language shift. But that is the only case where no language shift is assumed. So the standard assumption is that most, if not practically all mixed languages arise through a language shift situation, right? And of course, the question is how and where does Kallawaya fit in? And my answer to this is it doesn't fit in, right? It did not arise through a language shift situation. Okay, so let's come to the history of research on Kallawaya. And this is a table here which shows you the linguistic sources on Kallawaya, right? And you can see here that linguistically, or the Kallawaya language has been linguistically first documented only in the early 1950s. So presumably the earliest material is from Ponce San Ginés, probably also around 1950 or even before, but unfortunately it is unavailable, right? So the earliest available material we have is from Soria Lenz, who conducted some fieldwork around 1950. And the research on Kallawaya reached a moderate peak, very moderate peak of research in the 1960s and early 1970s, right, before it practically came to an end around 1980. So with the exception of Anderson and Harrison, who also provided our audio recordings I played some slides ago, the last research was conducted by Gifford and Lancaster in 1982. And we've got, all in all, we've got about 84 phrases and approximately 17,190 word forms. Well, we don't have our texts, right? We don't have any texts in Kallawaya, which makes research quite challenging, right? And with the exception of Anderson and Harrison, we also have no audio recording. So it's really difficult to listen to the language. So we can hardly say anything about the phonological characteristics of Kallawaya. And the reason why this particular publication is made prominent is because it's the first structural description that was conducted by Louisa Stark in 1972, so 50 years ago. And based on the 200 word Swadesh list, Stark claims that 70% of the vocabulary of Kallawaya is from Pukina, 14% from Quechua, 14% from Aymara, and 2% from Uruchipaya. And unfortunately, that stuck, right? So that is what people remember, and what was kind of burned into the people's mind. 70% of Kallwaya is from Pukina. Okay, so Stark continues in her analysis, structural analysis of Kallwaya, by saying that it seems quite probable that the Kallwayas were a Quechua-speaking people who came into the Charasani area from the north, so probably from Peru. That they were originally Quechua-speaking is attested by the fact that first, they speak Quechua along with Kallwaya, and second, the Quechua-based grammar of Kallwaya does not appear in reduced form. If anything, it seems to be almost identical to the Quechua spoken daily in the area, right? So that is an important observation, and also try to and keep that in mind, right? Okay, so the main findings from this first structural analysis of Kallwaya conducted by Stark in 1972 is, or are, that the vast majority of the Kallwaya lexicon comes from Pukina, 70%. Kallwaya is a mixed language, and the morphology of Kallwaya resembles that of Cusco Quechua closely. So Cusco Quechua is a standard prestige variety of Quechua spoken in southern Peru, right, the former Inca town of Cusco, which suggests that Kallwaya developed from a Quechua-speaking population. And now I would like to address 2 points of criticism here, right? My first point of criticism regards Stark's classification of Kallwaya as a mixed language, which is okay, but it's done purely on formal grounds, not on functional grounds, right? And I mean, it is okay to say that it is a mixed language, right? But I think the function of Kallwaya as a secret language is more important than its form, right? Its form as a mixed language. So in my account, and I will elaborate on this a bit later, in my account, Kallwaya is mixed because it is secret, right? So here we've got the famous form follows function, right? So mixing, or the mixed character of Kallwaya results from its being a secret language, right? However, I also, and in particular, contest Stark's claim of 70% Pukina enshrined in the Kallwaya lexicon on methodological grounds, right? So Stark subsumes every Kallwaya word that is not Quechua, not Aymara, and not Uruchipaya under the heading of Pukina, and that is methodologically awkward, right? Because these etymologically opaque Kallwaya items may come from various languages, not just Pukina, right? Remember that at the beginning of my talk, I said these healers are itinerant, so they are traveling a lot until Panama. And I mean, it's quite easy to imagine that they could have picked up a lot of words from a lot of languages, most of them probably unrecorded and undocumented, right? So there's quite a chance, quite a likelihood that words we do not recognize so far in Kallwaya, which do not come from words which do not come from Quechua, Aymara, or Spanish, or Uruchipaya, that these words may come from another indigenous language of, let's say, Colombia, right? And moreover, we also have to take into consideration, that is something Stark practically left aside, Kallwaya is a secret language, and as such, it may contain coined expressions, so kind of invented words, right, made up words, which following Stark's approach are then also counted as Pukina, right? And we know that Kallwaya has some words for made up, invented words, coined expressions for European items, plants and animals, right? So they have, for example, a word that is a particular word for horse, right, which is not based on the Spanish form caballo, but it's taken from, we don't know where, right? Or maybe entirely made up. Okay, so these points of criticism, and I would like to say that while the number of 70% of Pukina included in the Kallwaya lexicon crumbled a bit over the years, and the existence of other languages, notably Takanan languages from the lowlands, was acknowledged, it was still taken for granted that the Kallwaya lexicon is mainly based on Pukina. we'll leave that aside for a moment and come to the formation process of Kallwaya. And here Peter Moesken suggests two possible scenarios of formation for Kallwaya, which subsume, I guess, every possible, logically possible formation scenario, right? So, and both are mutually exclusive. Now, in the first scenario proposed by Peter Moesken, native speakers of Quechua invented Kallwaya by picking up Pukina words and inserting them into their native Quechua, thereby necessarily retaining the Quechua grammar. And that is reminiscent of what Stark said, because she remarked, as you hopefully remember, she remarked that the Quechua looks pretty much intact, right? Not reduced or anything. The second scenario proposed by Peter Moesken is that Kallwaya arose from a situation where a formerly Pukina-speaking community preserved parts of the lexicon of its ancestral language, that is Pukina, but had otherwise already shifted to Quechua. So here we go again, we've got our famous language shift situation. In a later publication, Peter Moesken links the development of Kallwaya more clearly to a shift situation, right? And says, well, actually we had Pukina speakers shifting to Quechua, but he also admits that after all, the origins of Kallwaya remain obscure. And well, the history of research on linguistic manipulations is a story quickly told. There was none, right? So the possible existence of coined expressions in Kallwaya is acknowledged by Peter Moesken in 1997, but no investigation of linguistic manipulations has ever been carried out for Kallwaya, right? So it was always said, yes, well, they may contain coined expressions and that's it. Okay, so the state of the art was that Kallwaya is a mixed and secret language. It developed from a shift situation in which Pukina speakers shifted to Quechua, and accordingly, its lexicon is mostly made up of Pukina words, right? And I propose a new approach to Kallwaya, because I argue that Kallwaya did not develop from a shift situation. Rather, I suggest that Kallwaya was deliberately created by Quechua native speakers, right? And evidence for this comes from the main objectives of my research, which include a quantitatively and qualitatively detailed etymological survey of the entire Kallwaya lexicon, an investigation of the formation of the Kallwaya language, and a comprehensive and thorough study of the linguistic manipulation strategies Kallwaya makes use of. Okay, so and that's what I'm going to guide you through now, the new Kallwaya story, where I propose that Kallwaya is better analyzed as a deliberately created language. Now, let us go back for a moment to the two formation scenarios proposed by Peter Moesken, where in the first formation scenario, native speakers of Quechua invented Kallwaya by picking up Pukina words, inserting them into the Quechua, their native Quechua structure, and retaining the Quechua structure, right? This scenario proposed by Peter Moesken can be equated with a more generally or more theoretically oriented formation process termed lexical reorientation proposed by Matras, right? So this is not explicitly or specifically aimed at explaining Kallwaya, the formation of Kallwaya, but it's a more generally oriented theory of how mixed and secret languages come into being, right? Lexical reorientation being one possible formation process. The second scenario proposed by Peter Moesken for the emergence of Kallwaya, where Kallwaya arose from a language shift situation, Pukina speakers shifting to Quechua, can be equated or can be clearly linked to another formation process proposed by Matras, the so-called selective replication, right? Now, lexical reorientation, and I'm quoting from Matras here, lexical reorientation is the conscious shifting of the linguistic field that is responsible for encoding meaning or conceptual representations away from the language in which linguistic interaction is normally managed, organized, and processed. So speakers adopt, in a sense, one linguistic system to express lexical meaning and another to organize the relations among lexical symbols, as well as within sentences, utterances, and interactions, right? The most obvious example of lexical reorientation are secret languages. So lexical reorientation thus aims at manipulating conceptual representation with the intention of disguising key slots in discourse. This implies a conscious orientation towards alternative sources of conceptual representation, including creative production of lexical items. Now that is the definition or explanation of lexical reorientation as provided by Matras. And it's, I'm really sorry, it's a lengthy quote, but I guess it's worth reading it in its entirety. So again, quoting directly from Matras, selective replication refers to a process which accounts for the continuous presence of structures from an earlier community language. Selective replication assumes a motivation to reproduce salient elements of a language without relying on grammatical operations, that is, on language internal processing instructions in this language. The process differs from lexical reorientation in that it does not, either specifically or exclusively, target conceptual representations, that is, meaning, but aims rather at reproducing contextually relevant actions of speech as speakers try and reactivate impressions of an ancestral language, right? So frozen or fossilized operative items, that is, inflection, may accompany reproduced material, but will usually remain non-productive. The main motivation for selective replication involves a turnover of the functions assigned to a linguistic system from that of an everyday community language to a specialized variety or register. So the idea is that an older generation of speakers still uses the ancestral language as an all-purpose language, but also as an in-group secret language. The younger generation shifts to a different language for all-purpose communication. And the process is indeed reminiscent of the development of secret languages through lexical reorientation, the difference being that the functional turnover hypothesis, that is our selective replication here, assumes a gradual decline of a language once spoken in the community as an all-purpose language, rather than deliberate recruitment of lexical material to substitute for key lexical items in the everyday language. And I call the attempt, that is, Matras calls the attempt to keep an ancestral language alive for purpose of secret in-group communication, selective replication. So brutally shortened selective replication assumes an origin or a formation from language shift, right? Any questions so far? Anything utterly unclear? Okay, everybody's still with me. Okay, now, and I will argue that in the case of Kallawaya, or actually that Kallawaya is the result of lexical reorientation, right? So Kallawaya did not develop from a language shift situation, not from selective replication, but rather that Kallawaya was deliberately and consciously invented by Quechua speakers, native Quechua speakers, and is thus the result of lexical reorientation. Okay, and evidence for this comes from the lexicon and the several types of linguistic manipulations, which we will discuss within the next couple of minutes. Okay, so here we've got the Kallawaya lexicon, or the, well, rather the etymological composition of the Kallawaya lexicon. And as you can see here, we've got 2,289 lexical bases. Now, this differs somewhat from the number of 17,190 word forms I just mentioned in the preceding table, right? And I got to this, or I got this number of 2,289 lexical bases by removing every reduplicated, compounded, derived, and inflected form from the Kallwaya lexicon. And in this way, the original number of approximately 17,190 word forms was reduced to 2,289 lexical bases, where the term lexical basis subsumes roots and stems, right? It's a bit difficult in Kallwaya to decide what is actually a root, what is a stem. So I took the easy way out and said, okay, let's forget about roots and stems anyway. Let's call it a lexical base, right? So a form that cannot be divided any further, at least not into meaningful parts. And these 2,289 lexical bases were then etymologically investigated. So I checked Aymara, Quechua, Spanish, Pukina, Uruchipaya, Kunsa, Takanan languages. I also checked some Arawakan languages, but they didn't contribute to the Kallwaya lexicon. So all these 2,289 lexical bases were etymologically investigated. And I would like to draw your attention to two findings which I find particularly interesting. So not 70% of the Kallwaya lexicon come from Pukina, as has been suggested by Stark, right? But instead, only 5.11% of the Kallwaya lexicon can be related to Pukina. And I mean, this is quite a difference, right? Coming from 70% as proposed by Stark to 5.11% of the Kallwaya lexicon that can be safely related to Pukina. The majority of the Kallwaya lexicon, that is 53.21%, remains etymologically opaque. That is, we cannot say where these words come from, right? And I think these are the two most important, most interesting findings from the etymological survey, that the greater part of the Kallwaya lexicon is etymologically opaque. Now, Quechua and Aymara each contribute around 13% to the Kallwaya lexicon, while Uruchipaya provides a little under 2% to the Kallwaya lexicon. And these findings are in accordance with what Stark has proposed in 1972. However, other languages, such as, for example, Spanish, but also Kunsao, that is the Atacameño language, and the Takanan languages also contributed to the Kallwaya lexicon, which was not recognized by Stark, right? She never mentioned Spanish or Atacameño, right? So, of course, there has been some criticism when I came forward and said, okay, fine, here, I'm sorry to tell you, but there is not that much Pukina. Actually, in Kallwaya, we have got only about 5% of Pukina enshrined in Kallwaya. Of course, one point that could be a counter argument is that it is quite likely that the 53.21% of etymologically opaque Kallwaya lexical bases include further and yet unrecognized Pukina words, right? So, I mean, if we've got only 263 lexical bases of Pukina, so it's quite likely that we know that the majority of the Pukina lexicon is lost, right? However, it is exactly this dearth of data on Pukina, which makes it impossible to determine the extent to which Pukina bases are included in the etymologically opaque part of the Kallwaya lexicon, right? We don't know whether of these 53, roughly 53%, all 53% are indeed Pukina, or only another 5 or 3 or 1% are Pukina, and the rest comes from we don't know where, right? We don't know. We cannot establish. I'm sorry. We cannot establish the extent to which Pukina is enshrined in Kallwaya. However, in any case, it is methodologically inappropriate to consider each etymologically opaque Kallwaya word as Pukina. Just a moment, I'm sorry. I'm utterly sorry. Okay, someone's really Okay. Yes, shit happens. Okay, you didn't hear that one. Okay, so I'm sorry about that. Let's come back to our Kallwaya lexicon, right? So what I want to say is that we really don't know how much Pukina is actually contained in the Kallwaya lexicon, right? It is, however, methodologically inappropriate to consider each etymologically opaque Kallwaya word as Pukina. So hence, I think it is better and let's say safer to speak of 5.11% of Kallwaya lexical bases that can be related to Pukina, right? Okay. What is also quite interesting is that of the known 263 Pukina lexical items, only 117 are also attested in Kallwaya, right? So this is approximately 44% of all known 263 Pukina lexical items. And of these 117 Pukina items in the Kallwaya lexicon, only 50, that is 42% of these 117, are shared exclusively between Pukina and Kallwaya, right? Only 50. The remaining 67 Pukina words in Kallwaya are shared with at least one other language, right? For example, Quechua or Aymara, and could thus have, in theory at least, could thus have entered Kallwaya via, for example, Quechua or Aymara. So we really don't know whether these 67 Pukina words in Kallwaya are, let's say, a direct import from Pukina, or whether they came into Kallwaya through contact with Quechua or Aymara, say, right? So, and I think this is really only a relatively low number of Pukina bases attestable in the Kallwaya lexicon. So the heterogeneous lexicon, as well as the low number of attested Pukina bases included in the Kallwaya lexicon, are more reminiscent of lexical reorientation than of selective replication, right? And when we speak of the Kallwaya lexicon, then we also have to speak of etymological manipulations. Now, I just talked at length about the languages found in the Kallwaya lexicon, which are Quechua, Aymara, Uru and Chipaya, and Spanish, which are spoken and understood widely throughout the Andes. So, of course, these words from these languages disqualify as secret languages, right? I mean, if you want to disguise something, if you want to be secret, it's not a very clever idea to use Spanish or Quechua, right? Because these are languages spoken practically everywhere. So, of course, words from these languages are not secret words, right? Because everybody speaks and understands these languages. In contrast, words from Pukina, Kunza, Takanan, that is Eseecha, our Takanan language, and etymologically opaque lexical items are not spoken or understood anymore in the Andes. And words from these languages thus form the lexical reservoir of Kallwaya, right? So the reservoir of words, of secret words, that is used by the Kallwaya herbalists in order to keep Kallwaya secret, to disguise its meaning, right? When people pass by and the herbalists don't want to be understood, right? So that is a lexical reservoir. Okay, yes, that's practically what I just said. Okay, so let's come to grammatical manipulation. So apart from words of etymologically opaque origin, Kallwaya also has some grammatical markers that cannot be related to Quechua. They cannot be related to Aymara, Uruchipaya, or Spanish. And here's a list of these forms. So we've got only 6 forms actually, so it's not really that much. And here you see them and the function or presumed function they have and the words they occur with, or the etymological origin of the words they occur with, right? And I make a distinction between dummy suffixes and what I call camouflage markers. So dummy suffixes have little to no semantic content, right? So if you take a look here, we've got a dummy suffix chu or chu, and another dummy suffix han with some variants like kan, ken, and len. which may act as a nominalizer, but this is really not particularly clear. Whereas camouflage markers have some semantic content, but it may remain blurred here. So for example, nacha and sti are two markers which are really quite difficult to understand, difficult to grasp. The meaning of these markers is difficult to grasp. Okay, so, and of course, the idea is that if most or all of these markers, right, of these Kallwaya markers, which do not originate in any known Andean language, if most or all of these markers are relatable to Pukina, this makes a development of Kallwaya from selective replication from a language shift more likely. If, on the other hand, only a few markers or none at all can be related to Pukina, then this points to lexical reorientation as a relevant formation process of Kallwaya. Okay, and just to give you a few examples of these markers. So in example 2, we've got a dummy suffix on plant names. So for example, on the right hand, we've got the base words. We've got Spanish mandarina, Mandarin, which becomes mantachu in Kallwaya. So the last two syllables of the Spanish word are detached and replaced by this dummy suffix chu. And the same happens with canela, Spanish canela, cinnamon, which becomes canichu in Kallwaya. And of course, the function is quite clear. They don't change the meaning of the word, right? What these dummy suffixes do actually is they disguise the form of the word so it is not recognized by people who are not initiated to the code. Now, in example 3, we've got the marker nacha, which is one of these slippery markers without any real, well, or at least graspable semantic content, right? On the right side, we've got again our base words. So for example, we've got sipi from Quechua, which means assassinate, kill, put out. And here we've got sipi nafakuna, which means strangulate in Kallwaya. And it's, yes, we feel there is some semantic relationship between these two words, right? But it is difficult to kind of pinpoint it and say, well, that is what nacha does, right? That is the function of nacha. It's better with the agentive marker nito, the Kallwaya agentive marker nito, which is attached to opaque words or Pukina words. So for example, here we've got a Pukina word S, meaning go or travel. And accordingly in Kallwaya, we've got isna nito, the person who goes, the person who travels, that is the traveler, right? And it also, the agentive marker is not only an agentive marker, it's also an adjectivizer, creating adjectives from nouns. So we've got an opaque word here, Pukina, hihina, or pihuna, meaning swelling, edema, pustule, and we've got an adjective here. Right. Now, what is interesting from the perspective of secrecy is that none of these markers can actually be related to Pukina. So in some instances, the Pukina equivalent is known and there is no formal similarity between the Kallwaya form and the Pukina marker, right? And this is the case, for example, with the Kallwaya agentive marker nito and the Pukina agentive marker, which is eno, no, or su, right? So there's practically no formal similarity between these two markers. In other cases, a particular Kallwaya grammatical element cannot be attested for Pukina. So for example, Kallwaya sti is not found in our Pukina database. And only two other grammatical forms of Kallwaya are actually really relatable to Pukina. One is the frozen form C, which might be a kind of a frozen ergative marker from Pukina in Kallwaya, and the reflexive marker cha. And now it's possible to identify from our Pukina data 79 grammatical elements of Pukina, right? So it's probably very far from representing the entire Pukina grammar, but at least we've got 79 grammatical elements in the Pukina data. And of these 79 known Pukina grammatical elements, only these two forms, C and cha, are attested in Kallwaya, right? the remaining 77 known Pukina grammatical elements are not found in Kallawaya. So the overwhelming majority of Kallawaya grammatical forms does not relate to Pukina. While these etymologically opaque grammatical markers may have some semantic content, it often remains kind of vague, and the main function appears to be disguising the words they attach to, right? And this strongly supports the hypothesis that Kallawaya originated from lexical reorientation and not from selective replication. Okay, and the last type of phonological manipulations is also quickly told. We've got two main processes here, substitution and deletion. Substitution affects vowels and syllables, whereas deletion occurs with syllables only. Here, some further examples. So in number 5, we've got the substitution of vowels. We've got base words, a base word from Quechua, which is kusi, meaning to have fun, to amuse oneself. And in Kallawaya, it becomes kusa, right? So the final I of the Quechua base has been substituted for A in Kallawaya, and the same happens with pampa, which is probably a well-known Quechua word known beyond the Andine area, right? Pampa means plain or pampas actually, and it becomes pimpi in Kallawaya, but the meaning remains the same. And as you can see here, both base vowels have been substituted in Kallawaya. The same with the substitution of syllables. So, for example, we've got Quechua word akarapi, meaning dim snowfall, which becomes achariri, with a reduplicated syllable here in Kallawaya with the meaning of mist. So the last two syllables of the Quechua word have been substituted by a reduplication ri in Kallawaya, or chochri from Aymara, wound or knock, becomes chochna, wound or knock. So where final ri has been substituted by na. And we've also got the deletion of syllables. So Aymara walkepu, describing a pouch for carrying cocoa, not unlike the one we saw at the beginning in the little picture of the Kallawaya hila. This is a walkepu, becomes walke in Kallawaya here on the left side, right? So the last syllable has been deleted. Or also quite interesting is kausiyu from Quechua, rubbery, elastic when chewing, is kausi in Kallawaya, chew, meaning to chew, a chewing gum, right? Phonological manipulations of Aymara and Quechua words in Kallawaya are unpredictable. They are utterly unpredictable. So it is unpredictable whether phonological manipulation of an Aymara or Quechua word will occur at all. So, for example, we've got Aymara poka, full, which becomes poko in Kallawaya. So the final A of Aymara has been substituted by O in Kallawaya, but we've got Aymara peke, meaning hat, which remains peke, hat in Kallawaya. So apparently there's nothing in the phonological shape of the base word that could tell us whether a word is particularly prone to phonological manipulation or not, right? The type of phonological manipulation is also unpredictable. That is, we cannot anticipate whether a Quechua and Aymara word will be affected by vowels or syllable substitution or by syllable deletion. Right? And we don't have a fixed set of camouflage syllables in syllable substitution. Instead, the phonological shape of the substituted syllable appears to be randomly chosen. And the same situation is, we find the same situation in vowel substitution. So we don't know, we cannot anticipate whether an I in Quechua will be substituted by O in Kallawaya, right? We simply don't know it. So phonological manipulation is the messiest, so to speak, the messiest type, the least systematic type of linguistic manipulation in Kallawaya. Okay, so let's come to a brief summary and some conclusions. This is in table 4 is a schematic overview of the linguistic manipulations in Kallawaya. And if your impression now after this talk is that these linguistic manipulations are chaotic and unpredictable and all over the place and horrible, this is not entirely wrong, right? My first impression too was that it is entirely unpredictable, chaotic, and doesn't make any sense at all. But when you work your way through it, you find that the linguistic manipulations in Kallawaya are actually quite systematically applied according to the etymological origin of a given Kallawaya word. Right. So, for example, here we've got the Kallawaya words and their etymological origin, and as you can see, Kallawaya words of Spanish, Quechua, or Aymara origin are subject to grammatical manipulations, receiving dummy suffixes, right? And Quechua, Aymara, and maybe also Urujipaya are subject to phonological manipulations, but Spanish is not, right? So probably because Spanish is so ubiquitous that it is quite useless to substitute vowels or something, right? So words would still be recognized. Pukina, any etymologically opaque lexical item, but also Kunsa words and words from erste form the lexical reservoir of secret words. So these words are our etymological manipulations, and Pukina words and words of etymologically opaque origin are also subject to grammatical manipulations, receiving camouflage markers, but not dummy suffixes, right? And quite interestingly, the only words or the only languages left unmanipulated, so to speak, are Kunsa and erste. So the one language spoken in northern Chile, the other one, erste, in the Bolivian lowlands. And apparently the Kallawaya speakers considered both languages or words from these languages to be foreign enough in themselves so as not to require any further modification. Well, you can see here that practically these linguistic manipulations occur practically in all subsystems of the language and affect words of more or less every etymological origin, Kunsa and erste leaving aside. Now, this systematic and encompassing use of linguistic manipulations in all subsystems of Kallawaya is not reminiscent of selective replication, right? Rather, it is better explained by lexical reorientation, which is characterized by manipulating conceptual representation with the intention of disguising key slots in discourse. And this implies a conscious orientation towards alternative sources of conceptual representation. So an interpretation of Kallawaya as a result of lexical reorientation is also strongly supported by the etymological composition of the Kallawaya lexicon, which is more heterogeneous and includes notably fewer Pukina words than assumed so far, right? Not 70%, but only 5%, as well as the observation that the grammar of Kallawaya is practically devoid of grammatical elements from Pukina. Those grammatical forms that cannot be related to Quechua, Aymara, or Spanish remain etymologically opaque. So I thus argue that Kallawaya does not originate in selective replication, but in lexical reorientation, right? And as such, Kallawaya did not emerge from a language shift situation, but instead was deliberately and consciously created by Quechua native speakers. And I will be quite brief about that because I guess you're tired too, but I would like to briefly address some implications and potential for further research. The systematic use of linguistic manipulations and more generally, the deliberate creation of secret language right? This points to a very high degree of linguistic awareness on the side of the Kallawaya speakers. And from these two implications, or one implication and one implied question arise, right? So we've got, the first is that consciousness and deliberateness may play a greater role in scenarios of language change, be it context induced or not, than has previously been assumed, right? So for example, if you've got a seemingly unmotivated change in language change, right, then it might be a good idea to consider as well, deliberateness and speakers' choices a factor that leads to that seemingly unmotivated change. And the other one is a question, namely, can grammatical manipulations tell us something about those parts of language that speakers can consciously access, right? Okay, a widely shared view is that deliberate change is not something that is at all likely to have more than minor influence in a system. And if it has any influence at all, this is usually considered to be restricted to the lexicon, but does quite certainly not affect the structure of a language, right? However, given the relatively numerous ritual, play, and secret languages that display deliberate modifications, I propose that linguistic manipulations are not confined to the lexicon and, moreover, may tell us something about those parts of language speakers can consciously access, right? Okay, so what we therefore need is a really fine-grained typology of the formal means of linguistic manipulation attested in ritual, play, and secret languages, right? We do have some typologies. We also have a typology on based on the social functions of secret languages, but what I have in mind is a really fine-grained typology of the forms linguistic manipulation can take. And relevant questions to be asked and hopefully answered by such a fine-grained typology are, so first, what kind of material is inserted into which place, right? Is there a fixed and possibly templatic set of phonological and grammatical forms that are inserted, or is it a random collection? Where is the material inserted? At the beginning or end of a unit, or in its middle, so kind of infix-like, or more like a prefix or a suffix, right? And are there fixed positions for insertion, or are they variable? Does the type and position of the inserted material relate to the typological profile of the grammar providing a non-secret language? That is what I would like to ask here is, can speakers consciously manipulate grammatical processes available to them through their grammar providing language, or can they access only the form of grammatical and phonological elements, but neither the process by which they are applied, for example, prefixation, suffixation, nor their position within a manipulated item? Okay, and with these questions, I would like to end my presentation, leave them to future research, and would like to thank you for your attention.